In 1902, a cattleman in North Texas stood over a drilling rig and lost his temper. He had been looking for water. In that country, flat, wind-scoured, the grass thin as paper by August, water was the only thing that decided whether a herd lived or died. He had sunk the well for his cattle. What came up instead was black and thick and worthless to a cow. His name was William Thomas Waggoner. Years later, he was still angry about it. He said he had wanted water, and they had given him oil. 9 years after that well, the ground beneath his pastures would open into one of the largest oil discoveries in Texas history. It would make his family one of the wealthiest in America. It would build skyscrapers, racetracks, mansions, and a private empire of 500,000 acres held together by a single fence line. And 114 years after that ruined water well, in February of 2016, the whole thing was sold to a man from Missouri who had never run cattle in his life. That is the strange part. The Waggoner Ranch did not fail. It was not lost to drought, though drought came. It was not taken by a bank, though the banks came too. It was not broken by the Depression, or the Dust Bowl, or the collapse of the cattle market, or the death of the open range, all of which it survived while ranches around it disappeared. It was 510,527 acres, roughly 800 square miles, 6 counties, more than 1,000 producing oil wells, larger than the city of Los Angeles, and held inside one continuous fence, which made it the largest ranch of its kind in the United States. And it was sold, intact, profitable, and famous, by the family that had spent 4 generations refusing to sell it. So the question is not how the Waggoner Empire was built. The records are clear on that. The question is what actually killed it. The answer begins with a decision made by a man trying to protect his family forever. Before the oil, before the fence, there was a boy from Tennessee. Daniel Waggoner came to Texas in 1848, a teenager traveling with his father into a state that had been part of the Union for barely 3 years. By 1852, he was on his own, a widower with a small son, running 242 head of cattle and 6 horses across leased range in Wise County. That is the entire beginning. 242 cattle. What Dan Waggoner understood, earlier than most, was that in the open range era, cattle were not the asset. Grass was. Cattle were merely the mechanism for converting grass into money, and grass was free to anyone willing to defend it. So he did not buy land. He followed grass. North to the Kansas railheads after the Civil War, then west as the frontier line pushed the Comanche and Kiowa out of the rolling plains, then north again into Indian Territory, where the tribes leased enormous pastures to Texas cattlemen for pennies an acre. By the 1880s, the Waggoners were grazing herds across hundreds of thousands of acres they did not own. His son, W.T. Tom, had come into the business as a partner. Together, they ran one of the largest cattle operations in the Southwest on borrowed ground. It was brilliant and it was fragile, and neither of them seems to have fully seen the difference until the ground was taken away. The federal government began forcing cattlemen off the leased tribal lands. Barbed wire, cheap and everywhere by the mid-1880s, ended the open range in a single decade. And then the weather did what the weather in North Texas always eventually does. The winter of 1885 and 1886 killed cattle by the tens of thousands across the plains, and the drought that followed finished the work. Ranchers who had built their fortunes on free grass discovered that free grass came with no deed. The Waggoners made a decision that would define everything that came after. They stopped leasing. They started buying aggressively, cheaply, and in enormous blocks, consolidating land across Wilbarger, Wichita, Baylor, Ford, Knox, and Archer counties, absorbing the failing outfits around them. They bought the ground for the grass on top of it. Nobody was thinking about what lay underneath. Dan Waggoner died in 1902, the same year as that ruined water well. His son inherited a ranch of roughly 500,000 acres and a problem. Land that size needs water, and North Texas does not supply it. So W.T. Waggoner kept drilling and kept hitting oil. He treated it at first as a contamination. An oily well was a failed well. He capped some, cursed others, and went on looking for water in a place that was quietly floating on one of the richest shallow fields in the state. In April 1911, a well called the Clayco No. 1 came in on Waggoner land, near a small settlement named for his daughter. The town was called Electra. It had a few hundred residents. Within 2 years, it had thousands, along with a rail spur, a boomtown main street, and the frantic, filthy energy of every oil strike in American history. The Electra field became the discovery that opened North Texas, and the drilling spread outward across the Waggoner pastures in every direction. Here is the detail that deserves a pause. Because the Waggoners had been forced off leased land 25 years earlier, they had bought their acreage outright, surface and minerals together at cattle country prices, before anyone had a reason to separate the two. Most great American oil fortunes were built by men who bought or leased mineral rights from landowners. The Waggoners simply already owned everything under their own grass. The failure of the open range had made them landowners. Being landowners made them oilmen, and the oil changed the fundamental nature of what the family possessed. A cattle ranch is a business. It produces, it fails, it can be judged by whether it makes money in a given year. What W.T. Waggoner now held was something else. An asset that generated income whether or not a single cow was sold, whether or not it rained, whether or not anyone competent was in charge. The ranch no longer needed to work to survive. That fact would keep the Waggoner Empire alive through the worst century American agriculture ever had. It would also mean that the family, for 4 generations, would never be forced to agree on anything. W.T. Waggoner moved his headquarters to Fort Worth and began spending money in the way of a man who has decided the money will not stop. He built a bank in Vernon and a refinery to process his own crude. In 1920, he finished a 20-story office building in downtown Fort Worth with his name on it, for a time among the tallest structures in the city. He gave each of his 3 children a ranch of their own, carved out of the estate, and a mansion and an income. Then in 1929, at 77 years old, he spent roughly $2 million building a horse racing facility east of Fort Worth called Arlington Downs. It had grandstands, stables, a mile track, and one significant problem. Pari mutual wagering was illegal in Texas. Waggoner built it anyway, and then applied his fortune to the Texas legislature until in 1933, the law changed. Hold that thought. We will come back to it. Because while he was building monuments, W.T. Waggoner was watching his 3 children with growing alarm. His daughter Electra had become one of the most famous spenders in America. The stories are legendary and probably not all true. $20,000 in a single day at Neiman Marcus, hundreds of pairs of shoes, wardrobes bought by the trunk in Paris. But the department store built part of its own mythology on her, which tells you the scale was real. She died in 1925 at 43. His son Guy was a rancher in name and a socialite in practice, a man who worked his way through a series of marriages and a large amount of the family's cash. Only a Paul Waggoner showed any instinct for the land, and his passion was horses. He would eventually build one of the most important quarter-horse programs in the world, buying a stallion named Poco Bueno in 1944 for $5,700 and later insuring him for $100,000, an almost absurd figure for a horse in that era. W.T. Waggoner looked at his children and drew a conclusion that any wealthy man might draw. They would spend it, and then their children would spend what was left. And the ranch that had taken 2 lifetimes and 1 geological accident to assemble would be sold off in pieces to pay for it, the way every other great American land fortune had eventually been sold off in pieces. He decided to make that impossible. In 1923, W.T. Waggoner placed the entire estate, land, minerals, cattle, oil wells, everything, into a trust. He divided the beneficial interest into 3 equal shares, 1 for each child. But he did not divide the property. The land itself was to remain a single undivided whole, managed as one operation in perpetuity. An heir could inherit a share. An heir could receive income from a share. An heir could not take a piece of the ranch and walk away with it. Read that again, because it is the hinge on which the entire story turns. He had built a fence around his own family. Not to keep them out, to keep them in. Whatever happened, whatever they became, whoever they married, however much they came to dislike one another, they would be locked together inside the same 5 or 10,000 acres forever. He died in December 1934, satisfied, one assumes, that he had solved the problem. 3 years later, Texas repealed pari-mutuel wagering. Arlington Downs, the $2 million racetrack he had personally legalized, ran its last meets and slid into obsolescence. The grandstands were eventually torn down. The land became suburbs. It was the first small demonstration of a pattern that would define the Waggoner story. An expensive structure built to guarantee a future, undone by a future that did not consult it. But the trust at first worked exactly as designed. It is important to understand how well it worked, or the ending makes no sense. The Dust Bowl arrived within months of W.T. Waggoner's death. Cattle prices collapsed. Across the southern plains, ranching families who had held land for 2 and 3 generations sold out, walked away, or were foreclosed on. The federal government bought and destroyed starving cattle by the millions. The Waggoner estate did not sell an acre. Oil revenue carried the ranch through the years the grass could not. Then came the drought of the 1950s, the worst in the recorded history of Texas, 7 consecutive years, which broke the back of Texas agriculture and drove a permanent migration off the land. The estate did not sell an acre. Through all of it, the ranch functioned. It ran thousands of head of cattle. It farmed tens of thousands of acres of wheat. Paul Waggoner's quarter horse program became foundational to the breed, and the 3D brand, the family's mark since the trail drive era, became one of the most recognized symbols in American ranching. When Poco Bueno died in 1969, he was buried standing upright at the ranch entrance near Vernon, beneath a granite marker facing the road. Visitors still stop for it. And in the middle of the century, the family produced its most improbable figure. Paul's daughter, Electra Waggoner Biggs, named for her spendthrift aunt. She became a serious sculptor, trained in New York and Paris, whose busts of Will Rogers, Knut Rockne, and Harry Truman put her work in public collections. She was celebrated enough that Buick named a car for her, and Lockheed named an airplane. By any measure, this was a dynasty succeeding. The trust had done its job for 50 years, but something was happening inside it that nobody had a mechanism to stop. The shares were multiplying. W.T. Waggoner had designed a structure for 3 people, 3 children, 3 equal thirds, 1 indivisible ranch. Clean, symmetrical, and entirely dependent on the assumption that families remain small and agreeable. Families do neither. Each third passed to children, and then to grandchildren, and then to great-grandchildren, splintering into fractions of fractions. And every one of those fractions carried a claim on a property that could not be divided and could not be exited. The heirs did not own land. They owned a percentage of an argument. By the late 20th century, the estate's interest had consolidated into 2 rival family branches, descended from different children of W.T. Waggoner, holding roughly 2/3 and 1/3 of the whole. They were cousins. They shared ancestors, a brand, and absolutely no agreement about what the ranch was for. And here the oil returns, in a form nobody anticipated. The mineral wealth had made the ranch enormously valuable, but it had also made it strange. Its worth was not in cattle, which could be counted, but in reserves underground, which could only be estimated. Different appraisers using different assumptions produced wildly different numbers. Depending on who was asked and when, the estate was worth $200 million, or $500 million, or approaching $1 billion. Meanwhile, the working ranch, the cattle, the wheat, the horses, the hundreds of employees operated on the thin margins that all ranching operates on. The older wells were declining, many of them stripper wells producing a few barrels a day. Income arrived, was split between branches, and left everyone convinced they were being shortchanged by the other side. One branch wanted to modernize, monetize, restructure. The other wanted to preserve the ranch exactly as it was, because that was the point of it. Both positions were reasonable. Neither could be acted on. That was the design. There was only one thing left to do with a disagreement that had no exit. In 1991, Helen Biggs Willingham, a great-granddaughter of W.T. Waggoner, went to court to break her great-grandfather's trust and forced the estate to be divided. Her cousin Albert B. Wharton III, known as Bucky, holding the other branch's interest, fought her. What followed became one of the longest-running lawsuits in the history of Texas. It ran for more than 20 years. It generated an almost unbelievable volume of paper: filings, appeals, motions, depositions, competing appraisals, injunctions, receivership disputes. Dozens upon dozens of attorneys cycled through it across 2 decades. Court records accumulated by the room. Judges retired mid-case. In 2003, a court finally ordered the estate to be sold and the proceeds divided, appointing a receiver to oversee it. That did not end it. It began the appeals, which consumed most of another decade, and the litigation itself became a kind of slow acid. The ranch could not make major strategic decisions while its ownership was disputed. It could not restructure, could not fully reinvest, could not plan beyond the next hearing. The cowboys kept working, the wells kept pumping, the wheat kept coming in. While above them in courtrooms in Vernon and Fort Worth, the family spent 22 years and an enormous quantity of the ranch's own money arguing about a document written in 1923. This is where the irony becomes total. W.T. Waggoner had built the trust for exactly one purpose: to prevent his descendants from destroying the ranch through conflict. But by removing every possible exit, no partition, no sale of an heir's share, no way for one branch to buy out another, no way for anyone to simply leave, he had guaranteed that any serious disagreement had nowhere to go except a courtroom, and no way to end except by destroying the trust itself. He had not prevented the fight. He had made it inescapable. Around 2014, after 23 years, the exhausted parties agreed to stop. They put the largest ranch in America on the open market. The listing was unlike anything in American real estate history. 527 acres in one contiguous block, roughly 7,500 head of cattle, some 500 quarter horses, about 30,000 acres of cultivated farmland, more than 1,000 oil wells, hundreds of miles of private road, 20 lakes, and a working town's worth of buildings, headquarters, and homes. The asking price was $725 million, the largest single property listing the country had seen. Bucky Wharton, who had spent 2 decades fighting to keep it in the family, tried to put together a bid for it himself. He could not reach the number. In February 2016, the sale closed. The buyer was Stan Kroenke, a Missouri businessman married into the Walton family, owner of the Los Angeles Rams, the Denver Nuggets, the Colorado Avalanche, and Arsenal Football Club. Terms were not disclosed. It was reported at or near the asking price. 168 years after Dan Waggoner walked into Texas, the ranch left the family in a single transaction. And then the final detail, the one that closes the circle. Kroenke did not break it up. He did not subdivide it, sell off the mineral rights, or parcel the pastures into hunting tracts, which is what happens to nearly every great American ranch when it finally sells. He kept the 3D brand, he kept the cattle operation, he kept it whole. The family fought for 22 years over whether the ranch should remain undivided. In the end, the only way to keep it undivided was to give it to a stranger. Go back to the well. 1902, a man standing over a hole in the ground, furious that he has found oil when he needed water. He was right to be angry, though not for the reason he thought. The water would have kept the ranch alive as a ranch. The oil made it something else, an asset so valuable and so impossible to accurately price that it eventually became worth more as a subject of litigation than as a place where cattle were raised. Grass can be shared, a herd can be split, but a mineral estate under 500,000 acres, generating income in perpetuity for heirs who have never worked a day on it, is not a business. It is a reason to hire lawyers. And the trust, the instrument built specifically to protect all of it, was the mechanism that turned that disagreement into a 22-year siege. W.T. Waggoner made 2 decisions, and each one was intelligent, and each one worked exactly as intended. He kept the minerals under his own land, which made his family rich beyond the reach of drought or depression. He locked the estate into a trust that could never be divided, which kept the ranch whole through the century that destroyed nearly every comparable holding in America. Together, over 4 generations, Those two decisions produced a family that could not be made poor, could not be made to compromise, and could not get out. The Waggoner Ranch was never taken. No blizzard broke it. No bank foreclosed on it. No market collapse ended it. It was sold because the man who built it succeeded completely at making it impossible to divide, and because a thing that cannot be divided, held by people who no longer wish to hold it together, has only one remaining way to become simple again. The ranch still stands. 800 square miles, one fence, the 3D brand still on the cattle, a stallion still buried standing up at the gate. Everything survived except the family.